This is the story of people living, working, and fighting on land with which we are familiar. Hunter Mill Road.
During the mid-1800s, Fairfax County was in the midst of an economic decline. The rich farming soil was exhausted from overplanting tobacco. Many farmers took their families and slaves and went further south. By the 1840s, new Yankee farmers were moving onto the land. Sarah Summers Clark said of the new Yankee farmers,
"These Northerners were different in manner and customs from the Southerners, and it was difficult for them to understand our way. We liked many of them and found they had a heart, even though it was not as big as a Southerner's."
All that was about to change. In April 1861, the South fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. Fairfax, with its proximity to Washington, would be a crucial link in the conflict between North and South. There was fear that Washington might be captured, which could be the fatal blow to end the Union, militarily, politically, and psychologically. President Abraham Lincoln, unwilling to allow the South to secede from the Union, began assembling troops. Virginia joined the other southern states in voting on whether or not to secede from the Union. One citizen, Townsend Sisson, went to the Fairfax courthouse with the intention of voting in favor of preserving the Union. Before he could do so, he was intimidated by a warning from a state senator.
"May I suggest that you do not vote if you wish to enjoy continued good health?"
Sisson chose not to vote at all. At Bayless Precinct, citizens who voted against secession were forced to change their votes. In addition, they had to sign an oath that this change of heart was made under no duress. In the end, Fairfax County sided with the rest of the state, voting 932 to 289 for secession. Only the three precincts where Northern influence was heaviest, Accotink, Lewinsville, and in Vienna, Lydeckers, voted to remain with the Union.
Lydeckers was one of the few precincts in the county to vote to reject the ordinance. Lydecker's store is now the Freeman Store in downtown Vienna. That is where most of the residents of the Hunter Mill corridor cast their votes that day. The vote formally expressed the divide between neighbors and even within families in the area. Some residents were more than vocal in expressing their feelings. Charles W. Adams, who lived near Hunter's Mill, had a drawn pistol at the secession vote at Lydecker's, allegedly threatening to shoot any man who dared to vote to stay in the Union. Threats of reprisal may have kept many from the polls on that day. Charles Follen, who voted for secession at Lydecker's, was arrested on December 18, 1861. He was charged with stealing property and giving information to the rebels. Alleged to be a longtime spy, he took the oath of allegiance to the United States and then broke it. He was captured while escaping and sent to the old Capitol prison. He was discharged after again taking the oath. The Union was determined to maintain control of the area and, as such, arrested a suspected Confederate spy, one Charles W. Adams. The same Charles Adams who had a drawn pistol at the secession vote and who had been active in harassing those loyal to the Union. He lived near Hunter's Mill and was always looked upon as a perfect desperado. drinking and fighting and stabbing and shooting. He denied all charges and the case was postponed as the prisoner was in the hospital with measles.
The terrible divisiveness of the Civil War was played out not only in the ballot boxes, but in the individual lives of families. Of the 8 children in Thomas Sisson's family, 5 supported the Union, and 3 the Confederacy. The most dramatic incident took place at Rose Hill, the Dulaney family residence on Franconia Road, where the elder Dulaney, a Union supporter, was captured by his very own son, one of Mosby's Rangers. While many families were taking sides, none of them anticipated a long war.
Hunter Mill Road was between the lines of the main armies of the 2 competing forces. The area was often in transition from the control of one side to the other. As each side asserted control of the corridor, the local men supporting them would return to their homes, having fled the area to avoid capture or threat of death when the opposition was in command of the area. In addition to the many raids and skirmishes along the road, great armies flowed up and down the passageway and crossed through on the Alexandria, Loudoun, and Hampshire Railroad line, now known as the W&OD Trail. They often took advantage of the fresh waters of difficult run.
Hunter Mill serves an important role during the Civil War. Served as a way to get to Antietam, to get to Gettysburg, and for the cavalry, almost every day somebody came up and down the railroad.
At 2 a.m. the morning after the secession vote, 8 regiments of the Federal Army moved across the Potomac to occupy positions in Alexandria and Arlington. Confederate forces were already dug in at Manassas Junction. Charles Sutton and Squire Millard fled temporarily after being warned that some men in Fairfax were going to get them for voting against secession. The Sutton family property was near the intersection now identified as Route 123 and Hunter Mill Road. These Confederate supporters were emboldened. Charles Johnson noted,
"I was never threatened to my face, but my wife told me that John L. Moore, a close neighbor and Confederate, came to my house and said he had authority to shoot or hang me on sight."
William Terry was ill at ease with the situation. Pickets were watching and restricting movements as usual. Mr. Constable, a neighbor, said William Terry escaped the rebels by dressing as an old woman and coming to the constable house. Then they both went into the woods to hide and were hunted by secessionists.
All the schools were closed, mills were guarded, and passes were given cautiously, often very much limited.
Jerry Dubois voted against secession at Fairfax Courthouse. He lived near Hunter's Mill and, because of his Union sentiments, was forced to flee and leave his wife and small children behind in a destitute condition. He had been arrested by Charles W. Adams, a secessionist neighbor just down the road. Mrs. Sutton and her 10 children left the area for Washington in a straw-filled hay wagon. Neighbors Squire Millard and Mrs. Ainsley left with them.
On the 1st of June, 1861, Fairfax would see its first skirmish. In fact, it was to be the first skirmish of the Civil War. The Union cavalry rode up Main Street and were met at the Fairfax Courthouse by the Warrenton Rifles, led by Captain John Quincy Marr. In the ensuing battle, Marr would be the first Confederate officer killed in the war.
The battle at Fairfax Courthouse. Since the end of May, Virginia soldiers had maintained a position at Fairfax Courthouse. 210 soldiers were under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Richard S. Ewell, who had recently resigned from the U.S. Army due to the secession. The 210 men comprised of 2 60-man cavalry units. One was called the Prince William Cavalry, and the second unit of 60 men was the Rappahannock Cavalry. The remaining Confederate forces were a 90-man company known as Warrenton's Rifles, under the command of Captain John Q. Marr. The purpose of the Confederate forces at Fairfax Courthouse was to protect against the Union discovering that the Confederates were building up troops at Manassas Junction, located about 10 miles south of Fairfax. Sadly, the Confederates were overconfident, believing the Union was at least 8 miles away, so they had only stationed 2 Confederate soldiers as pickets. Union Brigadier General David Hunter, on the evening of May 31, 1861, ordered Lieutenant Charles Tompkins and his men of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry to scout Fairfax Courthouse. Hunter wasn't clear about how to do this, but reports claim he urged Lieutenant Tompkins to probe the town. Tompkins took about 80 U.S. cavalry soldiers and a few volunteers from Camp Union at Falls Church, Virginia, to do the scouting. Around 3 a.m. on the morning of June 1, 1861, the Confederate pickets encountered the Union soldiers. One of the Confederate soldiers, a Private A.B. Francis, ran back into town yelling that the Union soldiers were attacking and that the other picket soldier had been captured. Men from the Prince William Cavalry attempted to form a line in order to repulse the Union's forces. As the Union soldiers approached, the cavalry that were lining up broke and ran, leaving behind 4 of their companions to be captured. Members of Warrenton's Rifles moved into the clover field outside of the church and formed into 2 battle lines. Under the command of Marr, they opened fire accidentally at the retreating Prince William Cavalry. This resulted in a Prince William cavalryman being wounded. The Rappahannock Cavalry didn't engage in the fight at all. They retreated at the initial site. They had been under-equipped and did not have enough weapons or ammunition to engage in a fight. Shortly thereafter, the Union cavalry rode into the field with the Confederate Captain Marr's troops. Captain Marr feared shooting his own troops again and instead approached the oncoming troops. The Union troops charged, and in the process, Captain Marr was killed. His body was recovered later that morning. After the initial fight, Colonel Ewell moved forward with about 40 of his men in an attempt to stop the Union advance. During the skirmishing, Ewell was wounded in the shoulder, but at the edge of the clover field, they had repulsed the initial Union advance. During the time that the Union troops had retreated, additional Confederate troops moved up and secured favorable firing positions, along with several of the town's citizens who were sheltered in buildings. This increase in fire capability allowed the Confederates to repulse the Union cavalry 2 more times during the evening. After the 3rd attempt, the Union cavalry left Fairfax Courthouse and returned back to their base. Each side suffered 8 casualties, including wounded, dead, and captured troops. After the battle ended, the Confederate command were incensed at the lack of ammunition and arms of its Union, while the Union command was furious with Tompkins for multiple freewheeling charges into town. The Confederates, however, were successful in keeping the buildup of troops at Manassas Junction.
On June 17, 1861, less than a month after the secession vote, Confederate Colonel Maxcy Gregg led 600 men of the 1st South Carolina Infantry on a scouting mission from Fairfax Courthouse up to the Potomac, and finding no evidence of the Union preparations to cross the river, was led to Hunter's Mill by Captain John Powell, a most zealous friend of the cause, where they found railroad cars still smoking on the tracks. Colonel Gregg remarked that the cars had been destroyed by our friends in the neighborhood. They expected to find Union troops repairing the railroad bridge on the way down the tracks to Vienna. Guided by George Washington Hunter, Jr., operator of Hunter's Mill, Colonel Gregg's troops marched towards Vienna, where they routed 271 Union troops of the 1st Regiment of Ohio Volunteers, who were approaching Vienna by train from Alexandria. 8 Union men were killed in the fighting. This conflict was among the first Civil War engagements in Northern Virginia and was the first tactical use of the railroad in the war.
President Lincoln ordered Brigadier General Irvin McDowell to march his troops from Washington to Manassas, where Confederate forces under General P.G.T. Beauregard occupied the railroad junction.
Confederate Commander Joseph E. Johnston had his forces arrayed in a line from Fairfax Station through Fairfax Courthouse and the Hunter Mill corridor, with an advance guard stationed further east at locations such as Falls Church and Springfield Station. In some cases, they were a mere 3 miles from the Union defensive line, which extended from Georgetown to Alexandria. the decision was made to fall back, and thousands of Confederate troops left the Hunter Mill corridor for winter quarters in Centerville. Outposts were maintained in the Hunter Mill area. In mid-July, the 8th Regiment of the South Carolina Volunteers was dug in along Germantown Road between the Flint Hill Schoolhouse and Germantown. On July 18th, Confederate General Millage Bonham commanded a large force, part of which was deployed at Flint Hill. They came under artillery fire from the advancing Union Army and withdrew per General Beauregard's orders to set up the Battle of Bull Run. The Union Army then moved in, stretching from Flint Hill past the Fairfax Courthouse on their approach to Bull Run.
On July 18, 1861, at the fords on Bull Run, the Confederates made a stand. McDowell's men were confident of victory. They anticipated pushing the Southerners all the way back to Richmond, the Confederate capital. The Union officers, so sure of victory, packed their dress uniforms in anticipation of a grand celebration.
The field battle after the fight presented the most awful sight you can imagine. At some point, I found it difficult to ride among the dead without treading on them. Headless, mangled, dying. My God, what a sight. And what a sin.
All in all, the Union suffered 1,500 dead and wounded. The Confederates lost 1,900 men, but won the day. General Beauregard wanted to take advantage of the Confederate victory and lead a full-scale pursuit into Washington. On October 1st, he and General Johnston met President Jefferson Davis at the Wilcoxon Tavern across from the Fairfax Courthouse. Beauregard's idea was scrapped as calmer heads prevailed. The defeat at Bull Run was not taken lightly by the Union. Lincoln ordered 68 forts to be built around Washington for the defense of the capital. 5 were located in the eastern part of Fairfax County. While the demoralized Union forces were regrouping, the flamboyant Confederate cavalrymen, General Jeb Stuart, took Munson's Hill and Mason's Hill near Bailey's Crossroads. These were to become the closest Confederate outposts to the city of Washington. President Lincoln was dismayed to see the Confederate flag flying from Munson's and Mason's Hills. From these vantage points, Stuart's men were able to train their telescopes on certain windows in Washington, where Confederate spies signaled strategic information on Union troop strength. In October, the Confederates, under General Johnston, fell back from the Bailey's Crossroads area to Centerville in order to consolidate their lines. On November 20th, 1861, General George McClellan staged a grand review of the Union Army at Bailey's Crossroads, an event designed to bolster sagging morale. The new Union Army was 50,000 men strong. With President Lincoln and the cabinet looking on, the Union forces spread across 200 acres of land. The sight of Union soldiers proved so inspiring that a young poet, Julia Ward Howe, wrote stirring new words to the familiar song John Brown's Body and created the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Little fighting occurred in the winter of 1861-62. The cold was the greatest enemy to Johnston's ill-fitted Confederate troops. The treacherous weather at Centerville proved devastating. Forests were depleted to build Confederate winter quarters. Farm supplies were confiscated. Sarah Summers Clark remembered,
"Our neighbors had their crops taken from them, and their pigs were in such demand they had to keep them in the house to prevent them from being stolen."
On December 20th, 1861, Drainesville saw the only action of the winter, which pitted Jeb Stuart against General Edward O.C. Ord. Ord brought wagons to collect hay from the southern farmers, but Stuart fought him at every turn, trying to save supplies from being confiscated. The skirmish, known as the Battle of the Hay Wagons, would be a harbinger of the fighting to come.
With patrols from both armies frequenting the corridor, clashes were inevitable. A series of small but deadly conflicts occurred over the next 5 months. On November 26th, 140 members of the 1st North Carolina Cavalry, under the command of Robert Ranson, were scouting the Hunter Mill area when they came upon the rear of a Union scouting patrol headed from Vienna to Hunter's Mill. The surprised Union soldiers, 94 men of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry, were attacked from the rear as they headed north on Lawyers Road out of Vienna. The Union troops, never having been under fire before, fled in panic, and a full-speed running battle ensued for nearly a mile to near the intersection of Lawyers and Hunter Mill Road. All of the military traffic to date had taken its toll on the land, the farms, and the people. By December of 1861, both Union and Confederate soldiers wrote that the encamped and passing troops had devastated the land. Worm fencing had been taken from the fields, crops taken, and trees had been cut by the acre for firewood and shelter. Confederate Major James B. Gordon wrote,
"Such desolation you can't imagine. The whole country seems laid waste."
Union soldiers under General McCall advanced beyond Hunter's Mill. They drove off Confederate pickets and on the way took 53 wagon loads of corn and wheat from the Gunnell farm, along with their hogs, horses, oxen, and buggies. They took everything. In early 1862, 5 squadrons of the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry had a series of confrontations with Confederate pickets, or advance guards, from the 1st North Carolina Cavalry as the Union troops moved to clear the road from Flint Hill to Hunter's Mill and capture the pickets stationed at the Peck's house along the road. First, the Union cavalry drove the pickets from Flint Hill to Germantown, and on the return from Germantown, burned Farmer Whaley's barn, which the pickets had been using for cover. They then headed north up Hunter Mill Road and encountered a mounted sentinel who was joined by Confederate pickets as they rushed into Peck's house and began firing back. The Union company surrounded and assaulted the house, even as they were being fired upon from the surrounding hills and woods. Union Captain Wilson led the charge, and as the official report says, in doing this, he received a serious and very painful wound from a rifle ball, which entered the ear, glanced around the skull bone, and came out of the back of the head. 1 Confederate soldier in the house was killed, and 4 were captured. Another squadron discovered even more Confederates in an old log house nearby, which resulted in a brisk exchange of fire. Again, prisoners were taken, 6 this time. But again, there were Union losses, including a sergeant who was killed. The Union cavalry reformed at Mrs. Brooks' house near the intersection of Hunter's Mill Road and Lawyers Road, where they were soon joined by other companies which had been sent to clear the area around the mill. Rebel pickets near the mill were chased 2 to 3 miles, but none were captured. Prisoners from the various skirmishes were sent to Freedom Hill with an escort, and the party turned south to Flint Hill before starting towards Fairfax Courthouse. Several sharp actions along the road had cost lives on both sides. By the evening of March 10, 1862, the first of thousands of troops of the Pennsylvania Reserve Corps were camped in small shelter tents by Hunter's Mill and Difficult Run with its fresh water. The whole encampment stretched from just north of the modern-day Dulles Toll Road to just south of the intersection of Hunter Mill and Lawyers Road. General McCall set up his headquarters on the edge of a grain field, while General Ord was just northeast of McCall. General Reynolds was south of the mill, and General Meade at the old miller's house at the top of the hill overlooking Difficult Run.
Now, we have some very nice flat areas here at Hunter's Mill, and up in the area, also an area we call the cornfield. So the troops came down here and they practiced their close order drill and their company drills and their formations and got ready to go on the Peninsula Campaign. 15 to 20,000 men, soldiers, came into our Hunter's Mill area here and completely devastated it. Cut down the trees, they burned the fence rails, stole from the local farmers, took their chickens, their hogs, and about anything they could get to eat.
A young correspondent stationed with the Union troops, one George Alfred Townsend, was on his first assignment and described Hunter's Mill at that time as he walked the road with McCall's 65-year-old quartermaster.
I strolled down the road with the old gentleman who insisted on showing me Hunter's Mill, a storm-beaten structure that looked like a giant barn. The mill race had been drained by some soldiers for the purpose of securing the fish contained in it, and the mill wheel was quite dry and motionless. Difficult Creek ran impetuously across the road below, as if anxious to be put to some use again.
J.R. Cipher, in his history of the Pennsylvania Reserve Corps, records as follows.
Orders were given at Hunter Mill, forbidding the men to leave camp, and a guard was stationed to enforce the order. The beat of the camp guard was on top of a railroad embankment, against which the bucktails pitched their tents. They proceeded to tunnel through the embankment, and thus provided a back door to one of the tents, through which the men passed to and from their foraging expeditions. They were faring sumptuously every day, until an officer passing that way accidentally stepped too near the edge, broke through, and slid into the tent through the back door, discovering the tunnel. He then ordered it to be filled up and the tent to be removed.
While encamped here, a small signal tower similar to this one was constructed. This would allow messages to be signaled to Freedom Hill in Vienna and then on to Washington in about 30 minutes.
In March, the Union Army advanced on the Confederate fortifications in Centerville as the Southerners under Johnston moved across the Rappahannock. Amazingly, the Confederate cannons were revealed to be a sham. The forts were protected by Quaker guns.
Quaker guns consist of tree trunks, cut off, positioned in the embrasures of earthworks to look like real cannon.
In July, President Lincoln brought in John Pope to become commander of the Union's newly created Army of Virginia. Pope cracked down hard on Southern sympathizers. Many were incarcerated in the old Capitol prison in Washington. The Confederate Army, in turn, arrested many Northern sympathizers and sent them to Libby Prison in Richmond. Life was hard for everyone.
Many of these were residents of the Hunter Mill corridor.
General Robert E. Lee, seeing a window of opportunity to strike Pope, sent Stonewall Jackson around Pope's army. On August 26, 1862, Jackson cut Pope's line of supply and communications at Manassas Junction. Pope abandoned his positions on the Rappahannock River and sent his forces after Jackson. It had been a year and a month since the two armies met on the same battlefield at Manassas. The Second Battle of Manassas proved to be as disastrous for the Union Army as the first. At Fairfax Station, 7 miles from Bull Run, Clara Barton arrived to tend the wounded. She described the scene to a friend.
The ground for acres was thinly wooded slope, and among the trees on the leaves and grass were laid the wounded, who were pouring in by the scores of wagon loads, as picked up on the field under the flag of truce. All day they came, and the whole hillside was covered. Bales of hay were broken open and scattered over the ground like littering for cattle, and the sore and starving men were laid upon it.
Barton treated the wounded and prepared to send them back on the train to Washington. Clara Barton became known as the Angel of the Battlefield and would later found the American Red Cross. The need for her services were great, as the Second Battle of Manassas produced more casualties than the first. The Confederacy suffered 9,000 dead and wounded, and the Union 10,000.
On September 1st, during a torrential afternoon thunderstorm, another battle was fought just outside Fairfax Courthouse. This proved to be the largest battle in Fairfax County. It is known as the Battle of Chantilly. In the South, it is sometimes called the Battle of Ox Hill. General Pope's forces were initially deployed around Centerville in strong positions, and General Lee sent Jackson around Pope's flank in an attempt to cut off General Pope's escape to Washington. This movement, however, was detected, and Union forces moved to intercept Jackson. The fighting at Chantilly proved to be a draw from a tactical standpoint. General Pope was eventually able to escape back to Washington. But the fighting at Chantilly cost the Union Army the loss of two of its best commanders. Generals Phil Kearny and Isaac Stevens were both killed in action.
On August 31st, one day after the fighting at 2nd Manassas, Jackson led his command northward along the Gum Springs Road, turned east on the Little River Turnpike, and stopped for the night at Pleasant Valley. By 7 a.m. on September 1st, Jackson's column was on the move again. Throughout the day, a screen of Confederate cavalry on the Little River Turnpike skirmished with its Union counterparts, alerting Pope to the threat on his right flank. To counter this threat, Pope ordered a Major General Joseph Hooker to establish a defensive position at Germantown. Hooker's movement caused Jackson to halt his command just 4 miles from the Germantown intersection, where he awaited the remainder of Lee's army. Pope, still uncertain of Jackson's plans, put Brigadier General Isaac Stevens' division on the march. His objective was to establish a defensive line across the Little River Turnpike 2 miles west of Hooker's Germantown position. By 1 p.m., Stevenson's division had begun its march east on the Warrenton Turnpike together with Major General Jesse Reno's division. Jackson's wing continued to await Longstreet's arrival near Ox Hill. Around 4 p.m., patrols reported the presence of Union troops just to their south. Jackson sent 2 brigades under Major General A.P. Hill to investigate the strength and intention of the nearby Union troops. Soon after, Jackson began deploying the rest of his wing for the upcoming battle. Stevens observed a thin line of Confederates advancing out of the woods north of the Reed Farm. To accomplish his orders and keep open the Union line of retreat, Stevens needed to drive the Confederates from his front. He deployed 2 companies of the 79th New York as skirmishers, sending them down the slopes of the Big Rocky Run and across the unfinished railroad bed against the Confederate skirmishers. Shortly before 4:30 p.m., Colonel Edward Ferrero's brigade arrived on the scene together with Major General Jesse Reno, the overall commander of the Union force. Reno, however, was rather ill and content to leave the tactical direction of the battle in Stevenson's hands without seriously altering the plan of attack. Instead, Reno directed Ferrero to cover Stevens' flank by moving into the woods east of the Ox Road. The 51st New York and the 21st Massachusetts disappeared into the woods, while the 51st Pennsylvania stayed to protect Durell's Pennsylvania battery as it came onto the battlefield. With what began as a constant drizzle now turning into a steady downpour, General Stevens could wait no more. As he and his staff dismounted their horses, Stevens called out to his men, "Division, Guide Center, forward march." With the commander's words still ringing in the air, Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison's brigade stepped off toward the hidden Confederate positions to their front. Stevens ordered his newly adjusted lines to advance toward the trees, but as they marched, the thunderstorm broke into its full fury. The pelting rain turned the bare earth of the cornfield into a muddy quagmire and soaked through the gunpowder, making many weapons useless. Despite worsening conditions and lowered visibility, Stevens continued to press his division forward. With his attack stalling, General Stevens grabbed the colors of the 79th New York and urged his men forward, shouting, "Highlanders, my Highlanders, follow your general." As he stepped over the remains of a snake rail fence, a single Confederate shot slammed into the general's temple, killing him instantly. Incensed by their loss, the Union forces surged toward the rebels just inside the woods. After Stevens' death, the Union command fell to Colonel Benjamin Christ. The disheartened 29th Massachusetts and 79th New York began to virtually disintegrate, and to make matters worse, the entire division was running low on ammunition. With the tide of battle shifting, Stevens' division began a slow withdrawal back across the fields they had fought so hard to secure. Prior to his ill-fated assault, Stevens sent his aide, Lieutenant Horatio Belcher, to look for additional support. Coming upon Major General Philip Kearny, Belcher requested that Kearny and his troops come to the rescue of Stevenson's battered division. Kearny exclaimed, "By God, I will support Stevens anywhere." Kearny, along with Brigadier General David B. Birney's brigade, arrived on the field at 5:15 p.m. As Birney's brigade moved into position, he was assured by Reno that Stevens' reformed division would support his advance. With Stevens' attack now repulsed, Jackson wisely made use of his lull in the battle to readjust Confederate lines in the cornfield. By strengthening his lines to better cope with any new Union threat, Jackson's position was greatly improved. Now in position opposite the Confederate right flank, Birney began to move his oversized brigade forward. Seeing that his right flank was not being supported by Stevens' battered division, as Reno promised, Birney requested that Colonel Orland Poe's brigade be placed on his exposed flank. Kearny rode off in search of more support for his assault. General Kearny came across the 79th New York and boomed out, "Scotsman, you must follow me." Finding the 79th out of ammunition, Kearny rode on. Just about that time, the 21st Massachusetts emerged from the woods east of Ox Road. Kearny ordered them to reinforce Birney's right. Brushing aside the protests of the regiment's commanding officer, Kearny repeated his order. Kearny, infuriated with the hesitation of the 21st Massachusetts, rode forward to determine the cause of their slow advance. Dismissing reports of nearby Confederates, he ventured into the cornfield for a personal reconnaissance of the front. Suddenly, Kearny was surprised by Confederates under the command of Colonel Edward Thomas. Wheeling his horse in a desperate attempt to avoid capture, Kearny was gunned down by the Georgians in Thomas's brigade. The disheartened 29th Massachusetts and 79th New York began to virtually disintegrate, and to make matters worse, the entire division was running low on ammunition. With the tide of battle shifting, Stevens' division began a slow withdrawal back across the fields they had fought so hard to secure. By nightfall, the Battle of Chantilly was over. Jackson, having failed in his objective to cut off the Union retreat, began pulling back from Ox Hill around 11 p.m. The last remnants of his command withdrew early on the morning of September 2nd. Union forces remained on the field until ordered to resume the Army's march toward Washington around 2:30 a.m. Both armies began more than 2 weeks of marching and maneuvers that culminated along Antietam Creek in Maryland on September 17th.
The casualties for the Confederates was relatively light, with only 800 men killed, wounded, or missing. Meanwhile, the Union suffered a larger setback with the loss of 1,300 men, killed, wounded, or missing, but the biggest loss to the Union was 2 Union commanders, Isaac Stevens and Philip Kearny.
Or maybe in one of those other hypothetical realities, Phil Kearny did live to fight again and led the Union Army to victory. That's for the theoretical physicist or maybe the poet. What can we then say about the battle president, who one day has stood up before a hushed crowd and given an immortal speech? Maybe in some...
After the death of Kearny and Stevens, one of the local people here, a guy named Ballard, actually first put up sort of some stones and a quartz boulder you might be able to see over there. Then, before 1915, these substantial stones were put here and erected by a sort of a Confederate family to honor where 2 Union generals had died. They're not actually buried here. Isaac Stevens was moved, I believe, to Rhode Island, and Phil Kearny was put under flag of truce and returned to the Union lines because the Confederates really controlled this battlefield afterward. This fight that ensued over the paving over of this Chantilly battlefield is how the modern battlefield preservation movement was born. In 1986, Bud Hall found that running helped relieve the stress of career devoted to the pursuit of conmen, gangsters, mafioso, and other shady, dangerous characters. Behind a plain one-story home on West Ox Road in Fairfax County, Virginia, a pair of small granite monuments sat side by side at the edge of a woodline, almost hidden by the tall grass and weeds growing around them. The stones were enclosed by a low rectangular fence of granite posts and pipe rails. The tiny memorial site, once tidy and treasured, was now overgrown. It appeared to be abandoned to the FBI agent who noticed it one summer day on a run through the woods.
Following General Lee's approval, Stuart had assembled 1,800 cavalry and 4 artillery pieces for a raid into northern Virginia. On Christmas Day, 1862, General Stuart crossed the Rappahannock River at Kelly's Ford on what would become known as the Christmas Raid. John Mosby had served with distinction as a scout during Stuart's ride around McClellan's army during June of 1862. He was now serving as one of Stuart's experienced and trusted scouts on this raid. The raiders proceeded to capture Quantico, Dumfries, and Occoquan, gaining some 170 federal prisoners and numerous supply wagons. Arriving at Burke Station, Stuart captured the telegraph office and listened to federal messages concerning where he was and what he was doing in northern Virginia. Here he sent a message to the War Department in the city of Washington complaining of the poor condition of the mules he had captured and was using to pull the captured wagons. Moving toward Fairfax Courthouse, he encountered a heavy Union force with artillery, and not wishing an engagement, bypassed there and took the road into Vienna. Winter weather had made the roads muddy and hard to travel. In Vienna, he found the excellent gravel roadbed of the Alexandria, Loudon, and Hampshire Railroad running north. This offered the opportunity to quickly move his artillery and captured wagons towards Herndon. Behind me is the junction of the Alexandria, Loudon, and Hampshire Railroad with Hunter's Mill Road, a strategic point. All during the war, Union and Confederate troops moved up and down these roads. Of particular interest to us is General J.E.B. Stuart's Christmas Raid of 1862. Stuart came up the railroad from Vienna and crossed here on December 29, 1862, headed for Herndon.
From Hunter's Mill Road on December 29, 1862, Captain Mosby accompanied Jeb Stuart here to the house of Miss Laura Ratcliffe on Centerville Road, 1.5 miles south of Frying Pan Church.
Major John Scott, who wrote a history of the Partisan Battalion in his book Partisan Life with Colonel John S. Mosby, related a conversation that occurred before Stuart left. Stuart called, in company with several of us, to make a visit to Miss Laura Ratcliffe, who resided near Frying Pan Church in Fairfax County. As our party rose to bid this lady farewell, I was surprised and pleased to hear the General address her in the following language. "You are such good Southern people through this section, I think you deserve some protection. So I shall leave Captain Mosby with a few men to take care of you. I want you all to do what you can for him. He is a great favorite of mine and a brave soldier. And if my judgment does not err, we shall soon hear something surprising from him." It wasn't until the next day, however, on December 30th, that Stuart actually left Mosby with a few men. Stuart and Mosby had traveled west from Laura's house into Loudoun County and were staying at Colonel Hamilton Rogers' house called Oakham. Oakham is located on today's Route 50, just east of Middleburg. As Stuart and his men left on the 30th, he left Mosby with 9 men. Thus, Mosby began his life as a partisan ranger and returned many times to visit, protect, and to gather intelligence from Laura throughout the last 2.5 years of the war. She would repay him by saving his life.
In January of 1863, this town of Fairfax Courthouse was occupied by Union troops, and there was large numbers of Union soldiers camped throughout the town. John Singleton Mosby started his guerrilla activities in January, February, and March of 1863, and he was becoming a pain in the side to the Union authorities.
In early 1863, the commander of Union cavalry in the Fairfax area was Colonel Sir Percy Wyndham. He had been exceedingly annoyed by Mosby's activities against his pickets and had actually sent a letter to Mosby calling him nothing more than a horse thief. This, of course, did not go over well with Mosby. On the evening of March 8, 1863, Mosby and 29 men left Dover, just east of Middleburg, Virginia, en route to Fairfax Courthouse. It was Mosby's plan to teach Wyndham a lesson. On the night of March 8, 1863, Mosby and 29 men left from Dover near Middleburg, Virginia, to capture Wyndham. Before departing, Mosby had said to a friend, "I shall mount the stars tonight or sink lower than plummet ever sounded." With able assistance from a former 5th New York Cavalry Sergeant, James Big Yankee Ames, who had recently joined Mosby and his men, the raiders slipped into Fairfax Courthouse without any major problems. Upon their arrival there, the general had spent the night at a party.
On the 8th of March of 1863, John Singleton Mosby went into Middleburg and he had dinner with Lorman Chancellor, who was the mayor of Middleburg. When he came out of the house, he mounted his horse and he wrote in his memoirs after the war that he said, "I shall mount the stars tonight or sink lower than plummet ever sounded." Now, I'm not sure he really said that, but that's just a neat quote. He then got on his horse and rode out to Mount Zion Church, and he met 29 of his men. And they started making their way down the Little River Turnpike towards Fairfax. Finally, at 2 o'clock in the morning, they made their way onto Route 123 and came into Fairfax Courthouse from the direction of Fairfax Station. Mosby would capture a couple pickets before he entered the town, and then he makes it to the courthouse, which is right here, and there's a couple tents, and he would capture some Union soldiers and a telegrapher. But he captured a Union private, and that Union private told him that at the Dr. William Presley Gunnell House was staying Brigadier General Edwin H. Stoughton. And Mosby would take 5 Rangers and go to the Dr. William Presley Gunnell House, which was nearby. They walk up the steps and they enter his room, and the general is soundly asleep in bed. Finally, he pulls off his gauntlets and he pulls up his bed shirt, and Mosby gives him a whack. And the general jumps up and he says, "What's going on?"
"You know who I am?"
And Mosby's like, "Well, sir, do you know who I am?"
And Mosby says, "Have you heard of Mosby?" And Stoughton goes, "Yes, have we captured him?" And Mosby bent down and said, "No, Mosby has captured you." We started down the Little River Turnpike, which runs by Fairfax Courthouse, to Alexandria. At Chantilly on the Little River Pike, there was also a strong cavalry outpost. I found out where there was a gap in the picket line between the two turnpikes and determined to penetrate, to pass his pickets and ride into his camps. When we got to Centerville and reached the Warrenton Turnpike about halfway between Centerville and the courthouse, we turned off to the right, flanked the corps directly in front of us, and came into the town unmolested at 2 o'clock in the morning. We had already cut the wires before we came into the town to prevent communication with Centerville. When we reached the courthouse square, which was appointed as a rendezvous, the men were detailed in squads. Some were sent to the stables to collect the fine horses that I knew were there, others to the different headquarters. We were more anxious to capture Wyndham than any other. There was a hospital on the main street and a building, which had been a hotel. I went directly with the larger portion of the command to the house of a citizen named Murray, which I had been told was Wyndham's headquarters.
Yes?
This was not so. He told us that they were at Judge Thomas's house,
Up the street there.
which we had passed on the other end of the town. So we quickly returned to the courthouse square. Joe had also caught a soldier who told him that he was one of the guards at General Stoughton's headquarters. This was the reason I did not go with Ames after Wyndham. I took 5 or 6 men with me to go after Stoughton. I remember the names of Joe Nelson, Hunter, White's Carver, Welt Hatcher, and Frank Williams. Stoughton was occupying a brick house on the outskirts of the village belonging to Dr. Gunnell. Mosby makes his way back to Warrenton and then to Culpeper, and in that raid, Mosby would capture a brigadier general, 2 captains, 30 men, 58 horses without a single shot being fired.
Abraham Lincoln said, well, I can make more brigadier generals, but I can't make more horses.
By early 1863, the Union Army trying to protect Washington had its orders: catch Mosby, dead or alive.
Mosby destroyed supply trains, broke up the means of conveying intelligence, thus isolating troops from their base, and confused plans by capturing dispatches, while at the same time compelling the use of large numbers of the enemy troops to protect Washington and the Potomac.
The Mosby they wanted was Colonel John Singleton Mosby, a 33-year-old Virginia lawyer who weighed less than 130 pounds, but was utterly fearless and almost uncatchable. Starting with less than 100 men, but growing to nearly 1,000, Mosby's partisan rangers were farmers by day who rode mostly at night, keeping the Union Army continually off balance and in constant fear of surprise attacks. If Mosby could force the Federals to strengthen their defenses around Washington, it would mean fewer resources to fight the main battle against Robert E. Lee.
Here we are in the W&OD Trail, one of NVRPA's best-known parks. In 1863, Mosby's Rangers launched one of their signature surprise attacks here in Herndon. It was March 17th. Mosby and about 40 of his Rangers came into the town on little-known paths through the woods. The Union troops here were expecting reinforcements any moment. Mosby was able to get within 100 yards of the Union forces before they realized that this was not their reinforcements, but actually an enemy force. Mosby's Rangers charge. The Union forces, who are not at all organized, most of them run into a sawmill that was right near here. Mosby runs in directly after them, and he yells to his men, "Set the sawmill on fire." At that point, the Union soldiers are terrified. They're in a wooden sawmill filled with wood chips, and they all surrender immediately. A few minutes later, Mosby and his Rangers are gathering up all the horses, weapons, prisoners, and he looks over and he notices a house right over here with 4 horses tied up that look like they belong to officers. He sends his Rangers in to inspect and see what's going on. Miss Hannah is there. She's the owner of the house, and she claims that no one is there, but the table is set for lunch. They know something's up. They search the house, can't find any officers, but they suspect that they might be up in the attic. So one of Mosby's Rangers takes his pistol and fires into the ceiling. While the shot doesn't hit anyone, it so startles Major Wells, who's up in the attic, that he falls through the plaster and lands on the floor. The Union officers come down, and according to Mosby, both the Union and Confederate forces in the room all had a good laugh at the expense of Major Wells.
2 weeks earlier, Mosby and his men got involved in another action that had all the aspects of a comic opera. The scene was here at Aldie Mill on Route 50, just east of Middleburg, which is another of the NVRPA's parks. Riding his new and high-spirited horse that day, Mosby and his men had spotted several Union cavalrymen around the mill. Mosby started to charge, but his horse began to outrun his own men, and suddenly he realized he had lost control of his mount. At the same time, he saw in and around the mill a sizable force of Union cavalry. As Mosby approached the mill on his speeding horse, waving his pistol and yelling, the Union contingent scattered, fearing Mosby was at the head of an overwhelming force. But Mosby himself, alone and well out in front, feared he might be killed or captured. So he jumped off his horse, giving the Rangers time to catch up. Some of the fleeing Union soldiers sought refuge in the mill itself, jumping into the wheat hopper, which was still operating. As Mosby later put it, some of the Union men nearly became flour. Others jumped into the flour bins, and as Mosby wrote, when we pulled them out, there was nothing blue about them. Mosby's impact on the Union Army in Northern Virginia was punishing, from small actions at Herndon and Aldie Mill, the middle-of-the-night capture of a sleeping Union general, to the lightning strikes against the enemy. During the last 6 months of the war, Mosby's Rangers killed, wounded, or captured 1,000 Federal soldiers at a cost of barely 20 of his own men. Then, to add insult to injury, Mosby sent President Lincoln a lock of his hair with the promise that he would soon have a lock of Lincoln's.
The Confederacy was in need of horses, so Mosby set up a camp with 4 men and a blacksmith in an area known as Hidden Valley. It was a collection point, and when they had enough horses, they would send them down to Richmond.
Now, the camp is located where the tennis courts are here today. There was a spring in there, and of course there was plenty of water for the horses, and I assume that they brought in hay for them. But this was only a temporary camp. There was only, I would say, no more than 3 or 4 men there, and for not very long periods of time. An item that was very interesting to them was a juice harp, which had a little metal reed right up the middle here. You put it in your mouth and you boom, 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 something like this to get the sound of it. And of course, around the campfire, there was nothing but beat a harmonica. So one thing we know about Mosby's Rangers, at least the ones in the horse camp, is that they were musical. Now, around the campfire, of course, you had to have some recreation. And one of the items that the round balls made very good, the round ball bullets made very good use of was a poker chip. And so if you took and flattened a round ball out, it made a very excellent poker chip, and you could certainly use that to play. Another item, of course, is a difficult run down here, did have some fish. So if you took a bullet and flattened it and put a little hole in it, it made an excellent fishing sinker. In the evening, one of the things that the soldiers liked to do would be to smoke and smoke their pipes. Now this is a clay pipe that came from here in the area. Some soldier, of course, it looks like he had broken it and he left it behind whenever they went on the march.
In August of 1863, Lieutenant Colonel C.R. Lowell, Jr. of the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry was sent to establish a camp at Vienna. His headquarters was on Josiah Bowman's property at a place currently known as Air Hill. While stationed there, he established a picket site above the junction of the railroad tracks and Hunter Mill Road. He stayed there through the spring of 1864 and had some success in lessening the effects of Colonel Mosby's command in the area.
There were 20 to 30 guerrillas in the neighborhood last night. They attacked the picket station of a corporal and 5 men near the Hunter's Mill with mounted and dismounted men, taking 4 horses and wounding 2 men. One of the wounded men near Hunter's Mill was shot a second time through the body by a guerrilla after he had surrendered and given up his pistol. Pickets were again attacked near Hunter's Mill at about 4 a.m. by a dismounted party, with a loss of 9 horses and 3 men captured and 1 man wounded. The party consisted of 50 men under the command of Mosby himself. They came down to the vicinity of the picket post and crossed the creek mounted, where a portion of them dismounted and advanced on foot to the attack.
Near present-day
Sterling on February 22, 1864, the Second Battle of Transvaal.
At Leesburg,
the Federals set out east on the Leesburg-Alexandria Turnpike, camping 6 miles east of the town that night. Mosby led the Rangers to the pike 2 miles west of Transvaal and deployed them in 3 wings, a dismounted squad on the pike and 2 companies on each flank concealed in the woods to the sides of the road. A skirmish party was sent west on the pike as bait for the ambush. At 10 a.m., the Federals broke camp and came upon Mosby's skirmishers an hour later. As the Federal vanguard in pursuit of the fleeing skirmishers, the flank wing sprung the trap, missing the main Federal force. Reed took advantage of the mistake and ordered a counterattack. The 2 forces collided in heavy hand-to-hand combat, killing Reed. With Reed dead, the Federal resistance gave way and the Rangers chased them north towards the Potomac River. Several of the Federal troopers jumped into the river in the haste to flee and drowned. Results: in the action known to the Rangers as Second Transvaal, the Rangers killed 12, wounded 25 and captured 70 along with 100 horse, while losing only 5 wounded and 1 killed.
On March 7th, in 1865, Second Lieutenant O.K. Galt of the 16th New York Cavalry led a 20-man patrol from Vienna to Flint Hill. Lieutenant Galt described the action which occurred in the field southwest of the old Methodist Church, he said as follows.
We discovered a body of mounted men coming from the woods on our right. At first sight, we thought them to be Union troops, as they were most all dressed in blue. As soon as we discovered that they were making for us, I commanded the front into line. Then, seeing that they were too strong, the men broke, and I ordered them to about face and run.
Major Emil Whipple of the engineers was quoted as saying,
"The road by Hunter's Mill is the main road to Fairfax Courthouse and is moderately good. This position is one of some military importance and can be defended by us against a superior force approaching by the Fairfax Road."
Accompanying the Union engineers were the 1st Pennsylvania Rifles, who were better known as the Bucktails, because of the bucktail worn in their caps. Mostly made up of hardy lumbermen from the mountains of northwestern Pennsylvania, these men were an independent lot, accustomed to hardship, and they were highly skilled marksmen. That ability with their rifles came to be useful as they were moving along a hill's crest near the mill. They spotted a squad of Confederate cavalry just about a half a mile away. While most of the Confederate cavalry moved behind trees, one Confederate soldier stayed in front of the cover, feeling he was at a safe distance. The leader of the Bucktails, a Lieutenant Colonel Kane, calmly ordered 3 men to pick him off. They dropped to their knees, took aim, and fired. Remarkable as the attempt to hit a man at that great distance seemed, the volley was successful, the cavalryman being shot through the back of the head, the ball coming out at the eye. Carrying his body with them, the Confederates fled after a sharp skirmish near the mill.
One of the sad occurrences at Hunter's Mill concerned the Reverend John D. Reed, who was the minister at the Falls Church Baptist Church. Reverend Reed ran a school, and in addition to being a minister, he visited the hospitals in the local area up there, and as such, he gained a lot of information. So Mosby sent a note to the Reverend Reed, sort of, "Desist, or you will be deceased." Now, the Reverend Reed continued, in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, there's a message going up, and it says, "The Reverend Reed knows the locations of Mosby's camp, 6 miles from Falls Church." This was Mosby's headquarters, the message said, but that was not Mosby's headquarters. What he was talking about was the horse camp here at Hunter's Mill. They captured the Reverend Reed, who was in the Home Guard, a captain of the Home Guard, and his colored servant. And they brought them on out. They went by Tyson's Corner and came into Hunter's Mill by the back way, ending up on what today is the 2nd Railroad Bridge. And Mountjoy gave the order to execute them, which is very sad. There used to be a little poem they'd sing when they were jumping, a jumping rope song, I think we called it, and it went sort of like this. "Isn't any school, isn't any teacher, isn't any church, Mosby shot the preacher."
We're standing on the Bowman property on the south side of Air Hill near Vienna, Virginia. The camp of the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry was at the top of the hill. It was here that a young man named William Ormsby, better known as Pony Ormsby, was shot for desertion.
Pony had ridden away from his command on the 24th of January, 1864, was caught riding with Mosby's men on February 5th, brought back to camp and tried on February 6th, and executed on the morning of February 7th. It was here that Ormsby was executed and buried by his own men. For more than a century, the exact location of Pony Ormsby's gravesite was unknown. He seemed to be destined to follow the fate of a great many Union and Confederate soldiers who had simply disappeared into oblivion. But it was later found, he was found hiding in plain sight in Arlington National Cemetery. Apparently, just before the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry returned to Boston to be mustered out, they marked the site of Pony Ormsby's grave. Later, government contractors hired to collect the scattered bodies from grave sites hospital sites and battlefields all over the state and collect them in Arlington National Cemetery, found and dug up Mr. Ormsby in Vienna and removed his body to Arlington, where it lies to this day.
We're standing here on the edge of Flint Hill Cemetery, Oakton, Virginia. I'm standing behind the Oakton Church of the Brethren that has the third building on this site. During the Civil War, as far as I know, there was an outpost here made of perpendicular logs put together, and it was a dispatch heaven for people riding with dispatches from Vienna to Fairfax. We're about 2.5 miles from Vienna, about 2.5 miles from Fairfax. There was no Chainbridge Road in those days. There was a courthouse road that goes down by the other side of the church from here. The end, as the guys came home from the war and went back to their normal pursuits, there were 3 Mosby men who ended up in this cemetery. They did what they had to do and conducted themselves nicely, and then in the end they were buried, as most men are, in the ground, and these happened to be at Flint Hill Cemetery. So we're happy to have those people with us in this cemetery.
Located on the very doorstep of the city of Washington, Fairfax County was a witness to combat operations throughout the entire Civil War. Colonel Mosby and his small but daring command were eminently successful in their hit-and-run ambushes, which intimidated, embarrassed, and kept close to 40,000 Union troops guarding their capital. Fairfax was one of a handful of counties that would become known as Mosby's Confederacy, where Mosby's legend reigned supreme and Mosby himself ruled the night.
Life's pleasures and count its many tears while we all